Hello, America, and welcome to Pivot Point, a show bringing you diverse views on the news. I'm your host, Maya Rockeymoore. This year was the historic March on Washington 50th anniversary, and there were a number of events. An event on Saturday that was organized by Al Sharpton's National Action Network, and an event on Wednesday that prominently featured President Obama and former Presidents Carter and Clinton, among other speakers, such as the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s family. And so here to talk about and to reflect on the significance of this 50th anniversary and to reflect on the events as they occurred, we are pleased to be joined today by Dr. Rob Biko Baker, who is the Executive Director of the League of Young Voters. Welcome, Dr. Baker.
Hi, thanks for having me, Maya.
Biko, do we know each other? I feel like we should have met in passing, at least in several spaces and places.
I think we have so many mutual friends that we probably are cousins.
Well, it's a pleasure to meet you on the phone, but certainly I'm an admirer of your work and all of the fantastic work that you do, certainly at your organization, but throughout the country, inspiring and talking about the importance of the youth vote. Today, Charles Blow has an interesting article in the New York Times. Have you happened to read it?
No, I have not.
He actually says that he felt like the speakers on the platform skewed older, and he's asking, where are the young people? The title of the opinion piece is called The Most Dangerous Negro, and I'm wondering what you think about that.
Well, it's funny because history sort of repeated itself yesterday. Leaders from both the Dreamers and United to Redream are supposed to speak, Philip Agnew and Sister Sophia. And unfortunately, because of time restrictions, both of those amazing young people who have done so much to take our country forward in the last 2 years were cut from the speech in the same way that John Lewis was cut but eventually allowed to speak. And so they were there. Unfortunately, they didn't get opportunity to express themselves.
Now, they did get a chance to speak on Saturday, did they not? I remember someone from the Dream Defenders on the stage.
Yes, Brother Philip Agnew gave a great speech on Saturday early in the morning, and there was a little bit more youth presence on Saturday as Maria Teresa Kumar from Voto Latino, Brother Reverend Yearwood spoke. But, when the president gets involved and Mr. Clinton gets involved, there's a little bit more of a scrutiny that takes place, I'm assuming.
Right. I guess you're thinking that these represent anti-establishment figures, and they were perhaps fearful of what they would say?
I've actually been digging a little bit more and trying to find out. I called Brother Philip Agnew yesterday to see what happened with his speech. He said he saw his name go up and go past on the teleprompter. So I've been actually through the progressive networks trying to find out who was the person that bottom line them being cut, because I don't want conspiracy theory to reign free, but I also feel that given the importance of the youth vote in this moment after Trayvon, we have to absolutely give people the stage. And I want to know what happened. I don't want the bad blood to linger, because I'll tell you what, these young people being cut yesterday has only made them work harder.
Well, I think it's interesting you mentioned Trayvon, because Trayvon Martin's parents were there. They were also there on Saturday, and I saw that, they got to speak on Saturday, but not yesterday. And so, I just think that I'm wondering if the discomfort on behalf of the White House, they do represent the institution of the U.S. government, and to the extent that, there are contestations, if you will, for people who are saying that the system isn't fair and it doesn't work, that does not necessarily bolster the legitimacy of government.
Yeah, I think we see sort of, after the Trayvon Martin or the Zimmerman verdict, Obama came out with an impressive speech, and it was sort of off the cuff. We've heard from people from the inside the White House that he didn't tell anybody that he was going to come out and do the speech. But unfortunately, unless we deal with these huge contradictions in our society, we'll continue to face social and economic decay until we go head on with the war on drugs and the fact that young black men and women have been over-policed and scrutinized for the last 30 years. None of this is going to change. And so I know we want to maintain our image on MSNBC and Fox and CNN, but we got to go deep, otherwise we'll continue to face problems.
But yet at the same time, I'm feeling the energy. I feel like something's different. I feel like people are waking up. I mean, I feel like this is my off-the-cuff analysis, that after the civil rights movement, African Americans got comfortable while other groups used the tools and the rhetoric of the civil rights movement to achieve their own gains in the civil and human rights space. Yet now African Americans seem to be coming back to the cause, if you will, at a broader level, with young people engaged not only in voting for presidents and mayors and other things, but also really becoming critical and really concerned about things like the Trayvon Martin killing, Jenna 6, just issues that keep popping up that show stop and frisk, that show that we continue to have racial issues in this country.
Yeah, and since you're seeing it and given your impressive track record, I think you probably have your finger on the pulse of the people. But I think part of that is because we connected through the internet. We're more connected than ever before. Young black people especially are, according to Pew Research, are the most active users of Twitter, and so they're posting information. They're not just talking about Miley Cyrus, but also I think books like Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow have come out and have sort of codified and solidified the stuff that we've all been feeling, but the data has been so overwhelming that I think we can no longer sit back. And a lot of people have always thought, well, this is because of President Obama or candidate Obama, but since 2000 and 2004, young black people have been trending in the polls, so I agree with your assessment.
Steve, I'd love for you to respond to something that Charles Blow actually says. He says that there remains a cultural complacency in America. After young people took to the streets as a part of the Arab Spring, many Americans like myself were left wondering what had become of American activism. When was the last time our young people felt so moved that they took to the streets to bring attention to an issue? And then he goes on to say, there is a vacuum in the American body politic waiting to be filled by a young person of vision and courage, one not suckled to sleep by reality television and social media monotony. Now, I'm struck by that because, you mentioned that young people are actually being turned on by social media, and he's suggesting that we're being co-opted by reality TV and social media. I'm just wondering what you think of his assessment, and is it wrong given the historic kind of movement of the Dream Defenders and other activists on the ground?
Well, I think, we have this romanticization of the civil rights movement as if every young person was on the front lines, and I've heard from my elders and mentors that that's absolutely wasn't true. But right now in America, there is a group and a rapidly growing network of young people of color who are working with young white people, young Latino people, young Asian people, from the Dream Defenders to the BYP 100 to the Dreamers to the League of Young Voters. And you may not see it, but I see it every single day.
Right.
Every single day, these kids are out marching, they're protesting, they were occupying. They just took over the governor's office. And yes, there is a large population of people that are watching too much Love and Hip Hop. There's also a growing and powerful a minority of activists who are coming. And there's a phrase that we've been using. It's called "We ready, we coming."
You ready, you coming, we coming. The other part of this is the fact that it's invisible. What does that say about the traditional civil rights movement and organizations? And is this organizing taking place outside of those institutions?
It's taking inside and outside. I mean, leaders of the Dream Defenders are, NAACP members, they're members of unions. It's inside and outside. And I think Charles Blow, he just needs to maybe subscriptions to the right news feed. You can follow me on Twitter at BIKOBAKER. I'll hook him up with some information.
All right, very good. And so I've heard, were you there yesterday?
I was not there yesterday. I was there Saturday.
Okay. Tell me how you felt as a historian. What was your observation about the commemoration, and what do you think its significance is?
Well, I think the most important thing is that it's amazing to honor the legacy of our civil rights heroes. This is something that would not have happened 50 years ago. And while I was a little bit frustrated that the march became so much focus on MLK, it is awesome to remind ourselves that our elders and ancestors came before us. And while they need to do a lot better with gender, I do feel like it was a righteous cause that should be celebrated. I do worry, though, that we have forgot how anti-establishment and how on the outside people like King, SLC, and SNCC were. And so while I read over Obama's speech, I thought it was a powerful speech. I feel he didn't do enough to talk about how the war on drugs and these huge structural obstacles have made it more difficult in many ways for young people of color to get jobs. And while I want to celebrate the progression and the progress that we've made as a country, young black people are facing obstacles that they've never faced in history. And I hope as we continue to push as organizers, activists, we can continue to talk about that.
What did you think the primary purpose of President Obama's remarks were?
Well, I think Obama is smart in that he understands that he will forever be connected to King and his legacy. And I feel proud that he acknowledged the work of those that have come before us. But I think it was a commemoration. I think it was a symbolic activity, and a good politician is always going to try to use any moment to capture energy and momentum. But I felt like it was really missing the true conversation that we need to have in this country. The war on drugs and structural inequality has made it harder for young people of color to get into the economy.
So my question to you is, where does this conversation happen? We know that President Obama is not going to lead it. He seems to have a discomfort with addressing issues specific to African Americans. To me, in reflecting on the speech yesterday, I'm going to have to go back and read it some more, because he did give a shout out to old age insurance, something that we talk about here a lot on this show in terms of retirement security. But I felt like his larger project was to get all Americans of all backgrounds to buy into, the dream that we have a commonality. Is his same kind of rhetoric of taking the specific and making it general. And so with that, I don't think that his purpose, and as the President of the United States, he has recognized that there are multiple constituencies out there, and he has ultimately been comfortable addressing LGBT issues, LGBTQ issues, immigration rights issues, women's issues, and of course he deals with Wall Street issues, and you name it, all kinds of constituencies. But the issue of African Americans has been a trap for him, and I would suggest that they made a political calculation, perhaps, that African Americans were always going to be in his corner, and so he didn't have to explicitly address their concerns because they would turn out for him regardless. What do you think of that?
Well, I agree with that. I agree with that 100%. I feel like he attempted again with his off-the-cuff speech after the Zimmerman verdict. And we've seen him come out strong on, the Philadelphia speech while he was running for office in 2008. Unfortunately, I feel like you're right, and I feel if the Democrats as a party aren't willing to address black people over these next 3 years, we will see voter fatigue. People anticipated voter fatigue in 2012. It didn't really come true, but unless someone acknowledges that black people are less likely to have a job, more likely to be foreclosed, more likely to be thrown in prison, we are going to see people opt out of the system more than they are ever before. And I feel like we can't let that happen as activists and organizers. We have to press in Congress. We have to press at the local city council. We have to press in the school board, and we have to press at the state level. Because while I do see the Democratic Party sort of being resistant to African American message, I can't lie to you. Republicans have actively been recruiting me as a progressive leader to get down with their causes. And while I'm a true progressive, there are people out here who would embrace the social message of the Republican Party and will become activists. And
Well,
I would hate to lose the momentum that we've built as a progressive movement.
Well, this is actually can there be a bipartisan progressive movement? This is an interesting question that you raise. I recently heard a member of Congress actually say that, most of the state houses in the South are now Republican, and there's not one single African American Republican in all of those states. And as a result, Republicans are in power. They have no one on the inside who can strategize and speak to the issues of concern to the African American population. And have African Americans been short-sighted and leaning so wholeheartedly with the Democratic Party? And is it possible to be a voice in the Republican Party that it has a more progressive bent?
I think I have friends who are members of the Republican Party, and they're active, but they're mostly there for economic reasons or social reasons. I think, unfortunately, we cannot, as black people, and I know there's no monolithic black person, but we can't, as a group, I think, move to the Republican Party as long as they continue to adopt voter ID,
right,
voter suppression tactics. When they do that, they're showing that they don't want our vote.
Well, my question for you is it showing that they have no one on the inside saying, this is dumb, this is stupid? You are actually energizing the opposition by trying to stand in their way for voting. I think that's what happened in 2012, by the way. And I don't think that people came out for Obama in 2012. I think that they came out to actually fight against the forces that be that were seeking to restrict the vote.
I agree.
Mm-hmm.
You saw I know you saw Colin Powell came out and said the exact same thing. And, look what they've done to Colin Powell. I have so much respect for this guy. I don't agree with him all the way politically. But they've done so much to try to tarnish his image and legacy. And if he can't be a true teller in the Republican Party, there's no way that a young person can be. But they're going to figure it out. In the same way that the Democratic Party might drop the ball, I think the Republican Party will figure it out, because I think there are young white people who get it. They are less for the social issues that the Democratic Party are on, and they're gonna embrace black people eventually.
Well, I guess my question is, should we be proactive about how that strategy evolves? Should there be engagement? I'm just saying this because I've been dealing with this. I've faced alienation of Democratic Party strategies, policies, and tactics, and at the same time, I'm highly skeptical of the policies and tactics of the Republican Party, and yet we have a two-party system. Now, you can talk about blowing up the whole thing, but I don't think that most people feel that we're at that point. The issue is how can we make and leverage what we've got to our advantage?
Yeah, I think I'm less excited personally about working with people on the conservative side until they embrace voter ID. But I do think there need to be people that go do that. And I would like maybe offline to get on your calendar and hear some about your experiences. I'm looking at your bio right now, and it's heck impressive. I don't know how you haven't burnt out and quit. But we do need to learn from you, because as people like myself and the dream defenders and the dreamers do come into power, we're going to see the same tricks and traps that you face.
Yeah. Well, so with that, the question becomes, what's next? We know that that Al Sharpton laid out a what's next agenda, that they're going to be doing some things in some states, he said, and but I'm not exactly sure how widespread that action will be, how inclusive it will be of people who are on the ground and who are making a difference and pushing. I'm just wondering what's next in terms of organizing. How can we institutionalize what I feel is happening, but I can't be sure that can be translated into a movement?
Well, this past Saturday, leaders from both Black Youth Project 100 and Dream Defenders and Dreamers and leaders from SEIU, young leadership, came together and put together a strong vision statement. And so I think what's next has to come from young people. And while I'm sort of like in the cusp of Generation X and Generation Y, I'm going to continue to look to people like Philip Agnew and Charlene Carruthers and all these young leaders who have stepped up over the last couple of months to take guidance for them and also provide counsel in many ways. And I encourage your listeners, to really get on Twitter, follow the Dream Defenders at the Dream Defenders, and see the wisdom that they're pushing forth. They don't want a gap between the civil rights generation and the hip hop generation. They're actively trying to learn from people that have come before them, and so we're going to continue to push for active policy. We're going to fight the war on drugs. We're going to push for Trayvon's law, and we're going to turn out in 2013 and 2014 because we're going to keep organizing.
All right, very good. That's Dr. Rob Biko Baker, the Executive Director of the League of Young Voters, a nationally recognized leader. Thank you so much. What's your website, Rob?
You can follow me at youngvoter.org.
All right. You are listening to Pivot Point with Maya Rockeymoore, sponsored by the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare. Stay with us after the break.
Americans of all ages and political parties agree they do not support cutting Social Security and Medicare benefits to pay for Washington's fiscal failures. Putting millions of middle-class and poor Americans and their families at risk in the name of deficit reduction is not fiscal responsibility. Social Security and Medicare strengthen our economy and our families. Call the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare at 1-800-966-1935 or visit us at thenationalcommittee.org. You can make a difference.
Social Security protects us against loss of income due to retirement, disability, or death. We pay into Social Security throughout our working lives, which is why we must stop Congress or the White House from cutting our earned benefits. Join our powerful national movement to protect Social Security for current and future generations. Call the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare at 1-800-966-1935 or visit us online at thenationalcommittee.org. You can make a difference.
When I started working decades ago, I didn't know anything about Social Security or Medicare. I was too busy earning a living, buying a house, and raising a family. But life has a way of surprising us. A death in my family and disability first introduced me to Social Security. I'm counting on it when I retire, and thanks to Medicare, I know I'll have the health care I need in retirement. Social Security and Medicare are vital to millions of American families. They also contribute hundreds of billions of dollars to our economy each year. So why are some in Washington threatening benefit cuts to reduce the deficit? It makes no sense. Benefit cuts for the middle class and tax breaks for the wealthy is not fiscal responsibility. It's bad for our economy and even worse for our families. That's why I joined the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare. Together, we're working to ensure Washington strengthens the programs we paid into throughout our working lives. Call 1-800-966-1935 or visit online at thenationalcommittee.org. We can make a difference.
Americans of all ages and political parties agree they do not support cutting Social Security and Medicare benefits to pay for Washington's fiscal failures. Putting millions of middle-class and poor Americans and their families at risk in the name of deficit reduction is not fiscal responsibility. Social Security and Medicare strengthen our economy and our families. Call the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare at 1-800-966-1935 or visit us at thenationalcommittee.org. You can make a difference.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
Welcome back to Pivot Point. I'm your host, Maya Rockeymoore. There is a lot in the news today. Syria seems to be heating up with the administration seemingly more willing to do more than they have in the past, perhaps take direct action. The headlines read now that actually Britain is making the case against Syria at the UN, and the UN is inspecting the sites to see if chemical weapons have indeed been used on Syrian opposition forces. And so with us today to talk about what's happening with Syria is Zaid Jilani. He is currently a graduate student at Syracuse University, where he is working on his master's in public policy. But prior to that, I knew him as a person who worked for the Progressive Campaign Change Committee. He's also worked for United Republican and Think Progress. Welcome, Zaid.
Great to be here, Maya.
You know, Zaid, it's hard for me. 2 years ago, I really felt like the choice was stark. You saw that the Assad forces were actually massacring their people, people who are in the opposition. And now it has become so muddled. I mean, Russia involvement, and it just seems so muddled that I'm wondering if it's more like Afghanistan now than it's not as clear cut. I'm just wondering what your view is on this potential intervention and whether it's justified.
Yeah, I mean, so the past, I'm far from a Syria expert. It's not my country of expertise, but for the past couple of years since the revolution started, really, as a journalist, I got close to a lot of, particularly the expatriate community of Syrian Americans, people who were really involved in this. And I was following this revolution from the point where there was really no violence on the side of the people protesting. For about 6 months, they were protesting without any, sort of weapons. And, actually at that time, the Syrian government was mostly just arresting people who were protesting. They weren't even using that much violence themselves. But then, they started to escalate and started to bomb protests. And they started to, commit atrocities to people who they were arresting and things like that. And I think it sort of went off the rails towards the end of 2011. Before that, it was more similar to the protests you'd see in these other countries in the Arab Spring, like Egypt, Tunisia, and Bahrain, with sort of police brutality, but not necessarily like a civil war. But I think, towards the end of 2011, it started to become more similar to what we saw in Libya, and actually more extreme than that, because in Libya, at least, it was a situation where the vast majority of the country was rising up against Gaddafi. He didn't really have any actual base, and, it's primarily his army against everyone. But Syria has introduced a sectarian element where there's actually a number of countries abroad supporting Assad, his ethnic group, or ethnic and religious group within the country supports him, the Alawites, versus sort of the larger Sunni majority. And, you have a situation that, I agree with you, isn't as clear-cut as what we've seen in other countries, although I do think that the one sort of singular similarity between this and the other Arab Spring countries is that Assad has sort of blocked and denied the ability to have any sort of political settlement or any sort of political process that would bring an end to the fighting, or maybe a transition to another form of government that people would actually be able to coexist in. So I do think that just as Gaddafi, Mubarak, the Khalifa family in Bahrain, Saleh in Yemen, I think just as the rest of them, he is sort of the main problem for that reason. But I do agree that it's more complicated because of the factor that it is now a sectarian conflict, and you have, 30-40% of the country that legitimately feels that if he falls and there's no real political process after that, they'd be put in danger because, at this point, the rebel population has been so antagonized that, they would feel like, these people were collaborators, or that they were conspiring alongside the dictator. So, I definitely agree that it's a little bit different than some of the other cases.
Well, it's different from some of the other cases, but I was arguing that it's even different from the early days of inside Syria, to the extent that you knew who the forces were. Now, as you mentioned, the opposition is armed. Where do those arms come from? Now we know that Russia has an influence in there. Now we know that, it's hard to know who's what. We do know that Assad and his army are still acting in a way that is detrimental to is actually killing people left and right. There is a question about whether this chemical weapons attack, which apparently killed many, many people, was actually launched by Assad. And yet America seems to be willing to make that case. I feel like people of a certain age remember when Colin Powell went to the UN to make the case of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And I just feel like we're at that point again, but this level of skepticism has increased.
I think that's totally true. particularly, the Iraq experience, I think, has shaped a lot of people's minds about how they approach this. I mean, Lawrence Wilkerson, who was the chief of staff of Colin Powell, who made that, really erroneous sort of speech before the UN, I was on Huffington Post Live with him a few days ago, and he basically said that he sees a deja vu moment for him. I don't necessarily view it the exact same way. I think in terms of how the U.S. is approaching it, there may be some similarities. For example, the Obama administration seems to not have very much patience for the UN to investigate, what happened with the chemical weapons attack, whereas most of the global community outside of, France and to some extent the UK seems to be willing to wait on the results of those investigations. Even countries that are very anti-Assad are sort of willing to wait for that, whereas it seems like the U.S. and a couple of its allies are sort of pushing to go ahead, even, not wanting to wait for inspection. So that's definitely a similarity. But I do think the overall situation is very different than Iraq, though, and that, the Iraq case was sort of made over, more than a year by the Bush administration. And it was sort of about attacking sort of a sovereign country that wasn't at war, initiating a conflict, right? But I think with Syria, the war is already on. There's already a conflict going on. It's a conflict that has sent over 2 million refugees to countries like Jordan and Turkey and Lebanon, and may cause instability in those countries as well. So I think there is a legitimate case for the UN to meet. The UN Security Council was created for this reason after World War II, to be able to deal with these security challenges so you don't have out-of-control wars like the world wars. So I think there is definitely a reason for the Security Council to meet and to discuss what to do, to review options, to do those sorts of things, because this is a serious situation. It's not a completely fabricated situation like with Iraq. But I definitely would agree that there are similarities about the foolishness of rushing to make any decisions right now, which seems like it may be happening in the U.S. and U.K. particularly, although actually as we speak, the United Kingdom's Parliament is actually debating what they should do with military action, which it actually is starting to seem we may not end up doing in the United States at all, which would be a very serious, I think, breach of our constitutional separation of powers.
What would be? I'm sorry, I missed that. What would be a serious breach of our separation?
I think it would be a breach if the Obama administration decided to take some sort of military action without
consulting with Congress.
Authorization from Congress.
Right. And that is actually a letter was sent by a number of Congress people yesterday saying that before they take action, they would like them to actually abide by the Constitution and consult with them in terms of the war powers. And so I would agree with that as well. I have a question here, though. I think you mentioned that we're looking at a region that is basically a powder keg. Egypt, I think, is still quite unstable. Turkey has had significant unrest. Lebanon, of course, has never gotten back to where it was decades ago. Even Jordan had some challenges to the reign of the king there. And so I'm wondering if the Syria intervention by Western forces will actually cause the whole thing to go up in flames.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's very hard to predict what an actual impact of doing that would be. I mean, I think that from a military point of view, if they did this in, let's say, like 2011, when the situation was primarily about an uprising rather than a civil war, I think you could have made a better case that the government would be intact. You'd be able to force Assad out. You'd be able to, create a better situation. But now it's definitely a much messier case. I mean, I've heard from people that, I think the end game for Syria has to be political settlement. There's no such thing as not having a political solution, because, like I said, you have 30-40% of the country that does feel like it's safer under the current government, given that it's turned to civil war, and you need to reconcile all of this, in this country. And the question is, how do we get to the political settlement? I mean, one of the problems is that Assad does not allow such a settlement. He's not really open to talking and negotiating at all, and to bring that about. And there's a few ways you can do that. One is using the military change of calculus, which can be extremely messy and difficult given how the situation has become. Another would be if his major allies like Russia and the Iranians were to start pressuring him. We know that Iran has kind of stepped back actually the past few the past week, actually, they've stepped back a little bit from Assad because of the chemical weapons incident. They were condemning it on Twitter, saying from their official account, saying that they would condemn a chemical attack even if it was from them, although I don't know if they've necessarily accepted that it was from the government. And with Russia, John Kerry's been spending a lot of time over there. And you would hope that even if there was some sort of military, let's say a buffer zone or something they create for non-combatants within the country, so people could at least live safely somewhere in the country from the rebels and from the government. You would hope even if that happens that this diplomatic track would be the more meaningful track, because it's not a situation that you can end quickly. I mean, there's people talking about how the United States should do some missile spikes just to punish Assad. Well, I mean, here's the newsflash: if you're bombing Syria's military, Assad is not going to feel punished, right? He's not. He's more than willing to sacrifice his military and his people. By June 2012, 6% of Syria's military had been either defected or eliminated. I mean, he's lost considerable portions of his military. I don't think he'll view it as punishment. I think the only type of international military process that will yield any positive results is something that will compel a real long-term political settlement that will maybe create some protection for non-combatants away from the civil war. But I do think it's a complete fiction when people are saying this can be done on the cheap, quickly, and it's worth it just to send a message to him. Because you're not sending a message to him if you kill some of his soldiers. He's already lost so many of them, and many of them are fighting against their will to begin with. I think that's a very silly notion. Like I said, I think the only real meaningful international intervention would be something that could bring about the situation for a political settlement, and it's not really clear what that is either.
Well, so, the polls show that Americans are overwhelmingly against an intervention, but they seem to find some support in limited strikes, like the use of drones or something similar. What do you think of that option?
Yeah, I mean, see, that's, again, I think where the political convenience comes into conflict with the reality. It's like, yeah, it's totally understandable Americans don't want their troops involved because troops could die, and they think limited airstrikes means cost less, this that. But there's no evidence that such a sort of light military intervention like that's just aimed at kind of harming the Syrian military would make any real difference. I mean, we talk about chemical weapons killing people, but 100,000 people, more than 100,000 people, have died from conventional weapons before that, and I think I read a study that said at this rate it'll be like 400,000
wow.
in 2014, right? So, there's no evidence that doing anything like that would do anything more than have a symbolic effect, and it would cause a lot of damage, too, because one difference between Syria and Libya is that in Syria, most of the fighting is in crowded areas, and much of the military sort of infrastructure is also in civilian areas and in cities, whereas in Libya, a lot of the fighting was sort of off by itself. So it's very difficult to say you could attack the Syrian military without attacking Syrian infrastructure a lot. So, the idea that you can do a very limited sort of intervention, I think, is just it's kind of foolish, and it's sort of more going to politics than it's going to the reality of the situation.
With that, I've got to ask you. The issue of Russia, these superpowers operating kind of like in the background, it has a real Cold War feeling to me, and I'm just wondering, to the extent that the West steps up this game, I'm wondering how the already antagonistic relationship with Russia will play out. As you well know, we're already on tenterhooks with them because of the Snowden situation, and before that there was already a bad relationship. I foresee this as creating worse relations.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the reasons why I've always been a strong supporter of the Arab Spring overall. Like, I've always wanted these countries to be able to succeed in their revolutions, not only because I got to know people who were part of the revolutions over the past few years, but because I think that if these countries were democratic and they were accountable to their people, that they'd actually be willing to resist sort of outside influences. So right now, you talk about the relationship between U.S. and Russia. I mean, the U.S. and Russia have basically played all these countries against each other for decades now. I mean, we I think rightly condemn Russia for being so close to Syria's government, but the United States is very close to Saudi Arabia's government, Bahrain's government, Jordan's government, Egypt's government, and Yemen's government. And basically great powers have manipulated this region for years and years. And what's one of the major differences between this region and, let's say, Latin America, which is fairly independent right now, or Europe, which is fairly independent, is that these nations have always lacked democracy. So it's very easy for a country like Russia, United Kingdom, France, Germany, United States to be able to produce, a handful of leaders who are not accountable to their public. I think right now the U.S. and Russia kind of are at loggerheads on this issue, but I think at the end of the day they kind of have a gentleman's agreement on the whole region as well, right? Because they're both extremely involved. They spend between the two of them, they probably spend, over 50% of the weapons to the region probably come from those two countries, to all these countries. So, I think that we will be clashing in this country in particular because it's a huge strategic asset to Russia and they don't want to give it up, and not as much to the United States. But I think it bodes worse for the people of the region. And that's why, over the bigger picture, I think it's really important that all these countries are able to democratize at some point, because I think they will become more independent, and countries like us will be less drawn into it because we won't be able to be into it because these countries won't want to see so much outside influence.
So actually, do you think, it looks like the Arab Spring in Egypt, if you will, that it was not successful at this point. That you have a country where the people rose up and they were not prepared for the electoral process. And as you well know, power abhors a vacuum. The person that they did elect, it seems like they were discontent with. And then when he was actually deposed by a military coup, the Western powers were silent. The people on the street were conflicted. And what we seem to have now is some kind of quasi-military governmental apparatus. I'm just wondering, when you talk about democratization through the Arab Spring, is that a romantic notion?
I think that whenever you see a series of revolts anywhere in the world in our history, there are a lot of road bumps in the way. The United States took a really long time to consolidate its democracy and still has a lot of problems with its democracy, as I'm sure you know. Remember, we lost 1% of our population in the Civil War, less than a century after our country was created, over, the issue of human slavery, right? And relatively, if you look at countries like Tunisia, I think they're still having problems, but they still basically, they had democratic elections. They have far more free speech than they used to. Even that's the case in Libya. And, I think a big part of it is probably the level of violence, right? So there was a tremendous amount of violence happening in Syria, and that'll be very hard to heal those wounds, even if Assad goes and there's a political process and some sort of elections. In Tunisia, there was very little violence in the revolution. So I think Tunisia is coming together much quicker and much easier than Syria for that reason, or Libya for that reason. But I do think it is a romantic ideal, but people always sacrifice them. People want to sacrifice their lives and risk their freedom for things that are romantic ideals. I talked to a Syrian protester about 6 months into the revolution. He came to the United States. He fled Syria. He came here. He was a journalist there, and he feared for his life. But I asked him why people kept protesting if they just kept getting killed in Syria, and he told me after 6 months there is no fear. They lost the capacity of fear. And I actually think that wouldn't be possible for people to do such a thing unless they felt like they were working on behalf of a very romantic idea. And they know there's a lot of challenges in the way, but they're not cynical about it. And to me, that's very courageous. And, it may be that it takes 10, 15 years for these countries to get on the right path. It certainly has taken longer for other countries that have been through similar circumstances. But I think it's very admirable what people over there are doing. And there will be a lot of setbacks like what we saw in Egypt. And hopefully that's another country where the U.S., very strictly sort of takes a hard line with the government until they sort of back off on their crackdown. But I think it's just incredibly courageous what they're doing, and I think they have history on their side. This is where countries go. They democratize. My parents are from Pakistan, and it's sort of swayed between civilian and military rule for its entire existence. But in this past election, we had the very first time where one civilian government elected civilian government handed power to another civilian government. And that took us 60 years, but we were very proud of it, and it was a historic thing. And, you know, I'm with other students who worked in Pakistan's government who tell me about, you know, what they did in their election campaign, and they're very, very proud that they got to that point. And I hope it doesn't take 60 years for countries like Egypt to stop, you know, having the military take over whenever it wants. But I think it's an admirable thing what they're doing, and I think they will eventually win.
Zaid, let me ask you this. I mean, the U.S. military, I think, is on its last leg in terms of the troops being overextended, in terms of, you know, certainly the experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan overextending our capacity. I think that not only are Americans tired of war, I think that our military apparatus, the soldiers themselves, are breaking under the strain of this incessant warring. Where do we get the nerve to say that it's time to go in somewhere else, given the state of our military?
You know, I think someone made a really fantastic point. I don't remember who it was, but they were pointing out that we were told that this sequester would, you know, which has obviously been very harmful for America for a number of reasons, but, you know, it's also reduced the military spending by quite a bit. We were told that this sequester would cripple our military, that we wouldn't be able to defend ourselves, that, you know, Al-Qaeda could take advantage of us, but apparently we still have enough military capacity to seriously suggest, you know, completely, you know, destroying a country's military, that, you know, a fairly strong country in the Middle East with a lot of weapons, Syria. So, you know, I think there's this mentality among American policymakers. There's this old saying that when all you have in your toolbox is hammers, every problem looks like a nail, right? And I think that for a long time, America's toolbox has been sort of weighted towards those hammers. And even now with a sequester that has been, you know, we have DOD staffers and troops on furloughs, and we do have reduced capacity because of this. Even now, I think our military planners are acting like our military has unlimited capacity. And, you know, I think this is an incredibly foolish thing to do, and it's something that other countries look at us and they just kind of laugh about it. I mean, rising powers like China boast about the fact that they don't engage themselves all over the world, and that they're not always at war, and that they don't have you know, troops everywhere. And, you know, with the United States, I think that even though President Obama probably has considered this, you know, fairly critically, I think he probably does have some impulse that we are at war too much. He really hasn't reversed it very much. He sort of followed through with the plan that Bush Jr. had of withdrawing from Iraq eventually, and then, you know, he really hasn't scaled back the military, and he hasn't, I think, given our troops the relief that they deserve. And, you know, part of it is the reason that, you know, the president wakes up every morning and the first thing the president gets is sort of a threat briefing about what's happening in the world. And it's we have massive bureaucracies that have their own incentives, like the DOD and the State Department, that are constantly viewing the world as places where we need to intervene, where we need to be using our military, where there's threats to our interests, you know, whether it be economic interests or some other sort of interest. And I think that, you know, the entire bureaucracy of the U.S. federal government has shifted towards looking at things as a matter of war. I mean, one of my former colleagues, Matt Iglesias, works for Slate now. He wrote something about Syria. And he was saying, you know, there's people suffering all over the world all the time. We don't view it as a crisis like we do with Syria, which I think is a crisis. But, you know, there's people dying of malaria all the time. There's child malnutrition killing a tremendous number of people, far more than they are dying in Syria. But we don't view it as a crisis. And I think part of the reason it is because the U.S. government had just since basically the Cold War, end of World War II and Cold War, has been set up as viewing one of its primary purposes as the military and intervening in the military and viewing the world as threats, rather than viewing climate change as a tremendous threat to our existence, or viewing child malnutrition, malaria, things like that. So, you know, it's part of it, just the entire bureaucracy needs to be shifted away from the way that our mentality is, really.
Right. If you don't mind, I'd like to briefly shift gears, and I'm wondering if you've been following this latest Republican showdown over the debt ceiling. The Treasury Secretary recently announced that it's going to happen. The government's going to run out of the ability to operate within the current budget limit somewhere in October. And the Republicans have responded that, you know, that they are willing to do brinksmanship yet again play with our nation's full faith and credit with the notion that they can negotiate cuts to the social safety net, specifically gutting certainly Medicare, Social Security, potentially Medicaid, what they call entitlement reform. And so I'm just wondering what you think is on the horizon. What are the American people in for?
It's incredible that I think we heard from the Obama administration several times now that they're not willing to negotiate over the debt ceiling. And, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure they said that, in the past when they ended up negotiating. But, my view on this has always been, and I wrote about this in 2011 at Think Progress, that if you look at the voting records of the people that are in Congress right now, Congress does not have a huge turnover rate. So it's actually a lot of the same people. The Republicans that are there, most of them have actually voted to raise the debt ceiling in the past with clean hikes. They don't actually think it's a good thing if the debt ceiling isn't raised. They're actually sort of fine with that. And so I think their major game right now is to try to con the Democrats into thinking they won't raise it. And they do this by pointing to people like the extreme Tea Party right that actually probably doesn't want to raise it. But there are enough of them, the sort of old-line Republicans, that if they join with Democrats, they should have the votes to raise the debt ceiling. And maybe Rand Paul or someone would try to filibuster that in the Senate. We don't know. So if I was them, if I was on the Democratic side, and I thought it was very foolish to try to cut Social Security benefits, Medicare benefits, the things that Republicans are trying to do when they play this hostage game. If I was on the Democratic side, I would just say, we won't negotiate, and we'll see you at 11:59, on the day of October, whenever the debt ceiling is scheduled to hit. And I would expect them to raise it. And there are various things the administration itself can do, even if Congress didn't raise the debt ceiling, to still manage that problem. We've heard about the $1 trillion coin idea.
And that sounds so chaotic.
Sorry?
I said it sounds so chaotic. I mean, is that a real option?
Well, again, I guess when we approach politics, we all have assumptions, right? And my assumption always is that this is primarily a game for the Republicans. They don't actually plan on voting against the debt ceiling hike. I mean, if you brought it up at 11:58 p.m. on the night of, I suspect that they wouldn't actually vote against it. If you start on the assumption that they actually would, then you'd have to negotiate, right? My problem with negotiating is Republicans' goal, their idea is to inflict pain on the retirement programs, right? They keep talking about entitlement reform. All that really means is cutting benefits.
Right.
Benefits are already very meager, and I see no reason. We have a solution to the debt ceiling. It's raise the debt ceiling. The more we negotiate about this, the more we're talking about something that maybe Wall Street's very concerned about. Wall Street's super concerned about the idea of whether the ceiling's raised or not because it's really important for their payments. But the average American is concerned about their retirement security. They're concerned about investments in America, and that's the Republicans' entire game. That's what they want to go after. And to me, if I was a member of Congress, I would just say I don't want to talk about this. I don't want to negotiate about this. We know the solution to the debt ceiling: raise the debt ceiling, right? So we'll do it. And if the Congress didn't do it, I would completely encourage the president to take any executive action they could, whether it's invoking the 14th Amendment, whether it's actually minting a $1 trillion coin, whatever it takes. Because I think the more we negotiate about this, the more we're in the realm of cutting retirement benefits, cutting investments, which is all the Republicans want to do, and that's why they want to have this entire hostage debate. So I just don't want to play the game anymore. We played the game in 2011, and we ended up where we are today with this sequestration.
Right.
With massive cuts to middle America.
Democrats and the Obama administration have continuously played their game on their terms and have gotten screwed, and the people have gotten screwed in the process. And it just strikes me that, this is the president's second term. There's nothing to lose. Why would we even go there? But with that, we are actually out of time, Zaid. I thank you for joining me yet again, and I look forward to having you back in Washington with a public policy degree soon.
Yeah, thanks so much, Maya. It's great talking to you.
All right. Pleasure to have you. You're listening to Maya Rockeymoore a host of Pivot Point, and of course, we always want to give a shout out and a thank you to our sponsor, the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare. We'd also like to thank our production team of Peter James Callahan, Sarah Byrne, and we would like to thank our listening audience for joining us every Thursday at 10 o'clock a.m. Eastern Time and every Sunday at 3 p.m. in Eastern Time. Until next time, America.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us